Thousands of migrants are arriving at the U.S. southern border in what some are calling a crisis. We will take a look at the situation there. We will also take a look at the COVID-19 pandemic and at the Biden administration's foreign policy. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The number of COVID-19 infections is rising by a small percentage in the United States. The Centers for Disease Control is concerned about relaxed social distancing rules, and it fears a new surge in cases, especially as a result of spring break travel. Meanwhile, the U.S. Secretary for Homeland Security says the migrant surge at the southern border is on pace to be the biggest in 2 decades. And not surprisingly, the issue is dividing Democrats and Republicans.
People feel like they can cross the border illegally now without the same consequences they would have faced when Donald Trump was president.
We are elevating our messaging so that the individuals do know that they cannot come to the border. The border is closed.
We will take a closer look at that and also President Joe Biden's foreign policy after Trump's America First doctrine. What's changed in Washington? Lots to talk about. Let's get to our panel right now. Let's bring in our guests, all based here in the U.S. Capitol. Joseph Williams is a senior news editor for U.S. News and World Report. ADOLFO Franco is an attorney and Republican strategist. Via Skype, HARLAN ULLMAN is the chairman of the Killowen Group, and Brian Becker is the executive director of the Answer Coalition, also joining us via Skype. Welcome to all of you. Joseph Williams, let me start with you, and let's start at the United States southern border. U.S. media, including CNN and the Washington Post, reporting that there's been a huge increase in the number of migrants trying to enter the United States. And the New York Times had a report which says that there's been a 61% increase in the number of unaccompanied children from January to February of this year. And we know how big a political issue this is as well. How is the Biden administration handling this?
Well, they're trying to handle it very carefully, and they're trying to handle it with compassion, but both of those seem to be failing, at least in terms of sheer numbers. They are trying to separate themselves from the policy of President Trump, where his border deterrence was very much based on the fact that if you come to the U.S. border, if you come to the southern border, you will not get any kind of aid or comfort. The Biden administration has said repeatedly that they don't want to follow in that particular pattern, mainly because they saw it as needless cruelty and an affront to the American ethos of welcoming immigrants, especially people who are refugees seeking asylum in the United States. But the problem seems to be a lot more complex than that, and the Biden administration still hasn't quite found its footing in what to deal with this problem. A lot of Republicans are pointing out that the surge has increased since President Biden, beg your pardon, took office, since President Trump was very much using a policy of some would say cruelty even, to try to separate parents from children as a deterrent to keep people from coming to the border. Now, it's been very much in the news. People have been looking at President Biden opening up these centers where young people are coming to be held in detention until their cases are coming up for adjudication. But even that's not working especially well, mainly because you have such an influx, and people are coming because they do believe that President Biden will treat them more humanely, and that at the very least it's worth the risk, given the fact that if they stay in the Central American countries, they are likely to either be killed or be kidnapped or find some other way that things will happen terribly to them because of the high crime, the corruption, the failed states that are basically forming the nucleus of where people are coming from. So it's a complex problem. The Biden administration has yet to find a solution yet. It's going to be a difficult solution, mainly because even his predecessor, President Obama, struggled with this issue. So it's one that can't be resolved by a White House alone. It is probably going to take Congress, and even their solutions are very, very hard to find.
ADOLFO Franco, the Biden administration is allowing unaccompanied children to come to the border and into the country. There are 5,000 of them right now who are being accommodated in the border area. What do you make of how the Biden administration has handled this?
Well, this has been an unmitigated disaster of the president's doing. during the campaign and certainly the beginning of this administration. The policies we had in place in the Trump administration were the proper policies. They were policies enforcing the laws of the United States. These people, to be clear, I was the assistant administrator of USAID. I was in charge of all of Latin America. These people are economic refugees. The qualifications for political asylum is not violence in a country or safety issues. That's not what our law says. So these are individuals that are coming here to work and coming into the country illegally. That's, to me, very clear. Secondly, and I think this is importantly, is not only do they not qualify for political asylum, but they're now not even being processed. The latest reports from Texas are that the Border Patrol doesn't have the capability to process, or they're being released. There are separations. These are individuals that are being trafficked. There's a trafficking and a coyote and illegal network that brings these people to the border for a fee. Don't believe for one moment that people are just walking all the way from Honduras and Guatemala. They're being transported by a criminal syndicate that this administration is aiding and abetting. What is shocking to the president of Mexico, a leftist president, is calling Mr. Biden the migrant president, is that the United States is not enforcing its laws and the agreements we had reached with Mexico and, in fact, the triangle countries of Central America,
right, that
we would hold people in Mexico and they would be processed if they qualified for entry into the United States. So this is a flood of individuals. Ironically, this is what got President Trump elected, and I believe was going to fuel not only his possible candidacy in 2024 again, but certainly that of Republicans. An unmitigated disaster that is incompatible with our law.
Okay.
That's to be clear.
Okay, Brian Becker, I want to address a few things that Adolfo just told us. One is the reasons for people arriving at the border, that they are economic migrants, that they don't fulfill the requirements to get asylum in the United States.
Well, we don't know because they're not being processed, just as Donald Trump refused to process them and, in violation of international law, declared that people seeking refuge and people seeking asylum don't have the right to do so, and so use police methods to shut down whole populations. I mean, a gross violation of U.S. law and international law. But that was Donald Trump, and I'm not an apologist for Joe Biden and the Biden administration, but I think we should put this in a larger perspective. And really, there's such profound ignorance about what's happening at the U.S.-Mexican border. That border was largely open until the 1960s. People came across, they worked, and they went back home. There was seasonal work. And then in the 1970s, the U.S. started the iron fist approach towards immigration, largely premised on racism towards people from Mexico and Central America. And then if you came to the United States, you couldn't leave. And so everyone who didn't have legal papers to be here, if they came across the border to work, they stayed here. And this created this huge influx of refugees or undocumented workers. And the last time the Congress had the guts to pass comprehensive immigration reform was 1986. So instead of actually having a sane, rational immigration policy and recognizing how labor has come back and forth across that border for more than a century, instead of that, we treat people from Latin America as a punching bag, and that's the problem.
Brian, one other thing, Brian, and that is, President Biden and his administration have said that they want to be more humane, be more sympathetic to the people at the border. But there was something introduced by President Trump, which was called Title 42, which enables the government to expel people on health grounds. That was used against migrants under President Trump. It's been retained by the Biden administration. It hasn't gone away.
No, it hasn't. And this is the demagogy and the false premise of the Republican agitation against Biden. Obama was called the deporter-in-chief. Obama deported more people than any other president in the history of this country. And the idea that Joe Biden, because he wanted to have something a little bit slightly more humane than Donald Trump, that he's responsible for the immigration crisis. They're still putting kids in cages. That happened under Obama. That didn't start under Trump. So again, there's a lot of the finger pointing, the blame game, the politics, the partisan politics.
Yeah.
The American economy depends on immigrant labor, but instead of giving people a pathway to legal rights and to be able to come and go, it treats people as criminals.
HARLAN, ULLMAN, one of the solutions being looked at by the Biden administration in the hope that they could stop the flow of migrants to the border is by granting more aid to Central America, trying to promote growth in those countries, creating job opportunities in the belief that if you do that there, then people won't be wanting to come to the United States to work here. In fact, Biden has sent 2 of his national security team to Mexico and to Guatemala for that very reason. Is that going to work? Hasn't this been tried before?
Armand, I am despondent. This country is irrational in dealing with immigration. The criticisms of Republicans and Democrats are extremely valid. We have made a mess of the situation. Joe Biden should not have canceled all of the Trump codicils. They weren't all bad. The fact of the matter is we have no strategy, no policy of dealing with what's happening on the border. One of your prior conversants was correct, saying it was not since 1986 that we had an immigration law. We are making this into a huge humanitarian catastrophe, and it's because our government, both parties, are incompetent, and I fear there's no solution. Trump did some things that were positive. Biden is trying to do some things. The fact of the matter is, because the country is so divided, 51% on every single issue, we can't come to a rational solution, and this is going to be an ongoing tragedy because this country is simply not capable of governing itself. And we are at fault. No matter what you say, whether you're Republican or Democrat, we are at fault because we cannot get together and govern properly. And that will be something that will be to the detriment of the United States for a very long time to come.
Adolfo, very quickly, and I know we have talked about this before, what are the chances of some kind of reform in Congress? I mean, this is a really big hot-button political issue. I mean, can we see anything happen in the next year or maybe in the next 2 years?
Oh, I think around the edges, but I think this crisis, I mean, around the edges, I mean, for the undocumented children that have grown up in the U.S., sometimes called the Dreamers, I think some of those actions are there bipartisan support, and that can probably be accomplished. I think it's going to be extremely difficult. You know, I'm old enough, I was around in the Reagan administration for the last reform, and at that time we were talking about 3 million individuals that were here illegally. Now we're talking really conservatively 15 to 20 million at least. It's not 11 million. The problem is a lot to unpack here in this program. It's all over the place, from political asylum to economic refugees to the different policies that were in place. But I think the pertinent question, the immediate question, we can have the philosophical discussion, is what precipitated the current situation? And I think the answer to that is this administration, and your previous speaker was correct. Policies that were in place that were keeping the border in check were overnight removed by the Biden administration. These immigrants, many of them are coming over with Biden T-shirts, if you see them. And there's a message. I ran, again, the U.S. aid program for Latin America. The messaging in Central America is that this is a ticket now, not that you're escaping anything, for a job in the United States. These people are seeking employment in the United States, and they're not guest workers in the 1960s. They intend to remain here permanently in the shadows illegally. That is their goal, and hopefully this administration legalized.
I have to move on. Joseph Williams, let's move on to the pandemic. Despite the accelerated vaccine rollout, we are seeing a small uptick in the number of infections around the country. Here is the director of the Centers for Disease Control. Let's listen.
Believe me, I get it. We all want to return to our everyday activities and spend time with our family, friends, and loved ones. But we must find the fortitude to hang in there for just a little bit longer. We are at a critical point in this pandemic, a fork in the road, where we as a country must decide which path we are going to take.
Joseph, of course, we've been through this for a year. People are being told to hang on for a little while longer. I saw pictures over the weekend of crowds at the beaches, especially in Miami Beach. People are behaving as if this crisis is over because we've seen so many people getting vaccinated. Is that a big mistake? How big a mistake is it?
Well, time will tell how big a mistake it is. I mean, right now the medical professionals are saying it has the potential to be a huge mistake, and that we're in a race against time between the number of people who get vaccinated and whether or not these new strains that are coming in from California, from London, from England rather, from South America, Brazil, whether or not they get a toehold in the United States, and whether or not they are resistant to the vaccines that we have on the shelf right now. So I think that the CDC director is absolutely correct. We are experiencing pandemic fatigue, but that doesn't mean we can stop. That doesn't mean we get to stop. And spring break was very much had the potential or had the makings of a super spreader event when you have young people coming in, no mask, shoulder to shoulder, hanging out in bars, hanging out on the beach, and pretending as though things are back to normal. They really aren't back to normal. We still are having thousands, tens of thousands of people per day who are being infected with this virus. We have thousands of people still per day who are dying of the virus. Sure, the numbers are declining, but they're still plenty high compared to what a normal year would look like. So I think the message has to be driven home, not just by the director of the CDC, but by leaders in politics. Here in the state of Maryland, where I live in the state of Maryland, the Republican governor of a blue state has said, you know what, we're going back to 75, 80% occupancy in restaurants. A lot of people are kind of nervous about that, because many people still have not received the vaccine, and the vaccine will not prevent you from getting the virus or prevent you from spreading the virus. It will prevent you from dying if you get the virus.
Right.
So I think that message needs to be driven home. I think that the politicians in states that are anxious to reopen and get that tax revenue back, they need to slow down a little bit, because the virus is going to have the last word regardless of what we do. And the economics may have suffered, but they could suffer further still if we don't get this under control.
Harlan Ullman, let's talk foreign policy, and there's been a lot of activity over the past few days. We've just had the first high-level talks between China and the United States, those talks taking place in Alaska. Very tough language from both sides. And we see that Biden has essentially kept much of the Trump policies in place when it comes to China. Do you think we're going to see any progress in the months ahead?
The question is whether we were daring or dumb. I find it inconceivable that an American Secretary of State would say, welcome to Anchorage, and basically, screw you, China. I mean, can you imagine Henry Kissinger or Jim Baker or Colin Powell addressing the opposite number? I mean, this is unbelievable. We have huge differences with China. So what you say is, we welcome that you come all the way to Anchorage, Alaska, halfway, and here's what we got to talk about. I mean, the Biden administration is being at least as bad as the Trump administration. And on top of that, when Joe Biden is queried whether or not Putin is a killer, he says, I agree. What about Mohammed bin Salman? And as a matter of fact, we are now having negotiations in Moscow over Afghan peace talks in which Russia is crucial. I just do not understand what this administration has in terms of a strategy. If you want to confront the Chinese, fine. But Rudyard Kipling was associated with the term softly, softly catchy the monkey.
Yeah.
Don't want to confront people and intimidate them. We have lots of issues, but you don't put this into a public display.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, I find what happened in Anchorage, I would fire Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, but of course, I'm not the president.
Harlan, one of the explanations given for what we saw in Alaska, and when I say what we saw, it was what we saw on camera right at the beginning, was that this was for domestic consumption, both in China and both in the United States, but the discussions that took place behind closed doors were far more, calmer, smoother, and more substantive.
Why would you believe that? I mean, this notion that there was a contrived agreement that we're both going to state these points. No, there are huge differences of agreement. And what was said in public was, I think, probably relayed in private. I mean, look, there needs to be, when Henry Kissinger first went to China to talk to Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong, to try to have a rapprochement. Henry didn't confront the Chinese. We need to do this in a back channel. This was an absurd negotiation. There was no strategy. There was no outcome. And quite frankly, I am really fearful that the Biden administration may be as incompetent as the Trump administration.
All right, Brian Becker, you know, Harlan just talked to us a moment ago about the fact that President Biden was asked about Vladimir Putin and whether he was a killer, and he agreed. I mean, also very intemperate language being used there by the United States to people that it conceives as its foreign adversaries. I mean, here we have the United States picking fights with two nuclear-armed countries.
Yeah, not only picking fights with them, but as of 2018, reorienting U.S. military and foreign policy doctrine such that major power confrontation or conflict is now the priority for the United States. So this dust-up, if you would, or this harsh, arrogant language that employed by the United States against the people of China, the leaders of China, and likewise with Russia, it shows that the environment has changed. It's not accidental, and it's not Biden or Trump. There has emerged a consensus position within the U.S. establishment, within the foreign policy and military establishment, that China's peaceful rise economically, China hasn't dropped bombs on other countries, not invading them, not occupying them, extending, you know, favorable investment opportunities to them. That rise by China is considered now an existential threat. The Chinese kept saying, well, why don't we have win-win? Our rise doesn't mean your negation. But the American government absolutely refuses to accept this logic. And so the U.S. treats the world, and thus China, as its playground, as its empire, and thus any other power that grows is in fact an existential challenge to the dominance of the empire. So now you have the Pentagon, they're preparing for conflict in the South China Sea. Does that seem insane? Yes, because it's insane. But the fact of the matter is the danger here is that unlike the old Cold War, where there was a managed rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, at least at a certain point by the 1960s, this rivalry can be quickly unmanaged. Hopefully it won't, but that's the danger.
Joseph Williams, when we look at what's been happening, you know, in relation to Russia and China, doesn't it put huge question marks over how serious the United States is about resetting relationships with these countries like China and Russia?
Well, it certainly does. I mean, because there's no, one would argue that the roadmap under President Trump was a little bit convoluted, and you expected President Biden, who has a lot of foreign policy experience, who has deep foreign policy interests, that they would take a different tack and that things would be a little bit less confrontational. But there are high stakes here. I mean, the economic development that China offers to other U.S. countries or to other countries is very strategic. And let's not forget the Chinese have established bases in the South China Sea during the Obama administration. They're now continuing to build up their Navy. There are serious threats about whether or not this soft power will translate into hard power and converting allies from the United States to those of China, and it's hard to expect, it's hard to determine exactly where that's going to go. So I think President Biden, with such a short time in office so far, is still kind of feeling out the situation. I think there are talks going on behind the scenes. I mean, that's the nature of diplomacy itself, is to not have these confrontations, but to talk to people and have lower-level emissaries discuss what is possible. So I think that we're still in the first quarter. There's a lot to determine. I'm not sure we're going to have an ironclad confrontation or a deal per se until both sides figure out where the sticking points are and where they can come together.
Adolfo, Franco, when President Biden was running for election during the campaign, he said that he would bring the United States back into the deal with Iran, the nuclear deal, the JCPOA as it's called. But since he became president, he's placed more conditions on Iran. He's also imposed sanctions, more sanctions on Iran right now. The policy on China has been effectively the same as the one that President Trump had on China. So what's going on here?
Well, I think he's learned something, and I think there's an appreciation of what was being done. I couldn't disagree more with all the other guests with respect to both Iran and China. This is not the China of 1971. To answer about China first, China has the largest navy in the world now, 3 aircraft carriers, the largest standing army. Its influence is not limited to the South China Sea.
Yeah.
It's global, Africa, Latin America, and so forth. So it is a threat to our country. I don't think this was a confrontational meeting at all. I think it's a sizing up of both sides.
Yeah.
If you want to have history, the same thing between Khrushchev and Kennedy 60 years ago. With respect to Iran, it's the same situation. I think once you get into power and you see, as he has, what the options are, and what the reality is that Iran is on the road and has always been on the road. We have bought some time to develop a nuclear weapon. I would love to have these sort of nice theoretical notions about diplomacy and working. We're in a competitive world, militarily and economically, certainly with China, and Iran is a threat to the stability of the Middle East and to our allies. So I think what you're seeing in the Biden administration, I hope, is a dose of reality. I worked for John McCain. He once said that Tony Blakely and Joe Biden, as Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, said, have been wrong on every foreign policy issue. I hope now there's an appreciation with the Trump policies that the world is far more dangerous, more complicated. It is not what it was 10 years ago, much less 50 years ago with respect to China. So I think the United States position should be one of coming from strength and one of making very clear that we are prepared to compete militarily and economically to protect our interests.
Harlan Ullman, what's your view on that? I mean, that times have changed.
That is absolute nonsense. I mean, I don't know what planet this guy is
No.
coming from. The Cold War was far more dangerous.
The reality.
We've exaggerated the Chinese threat by a huge order of magnitude. I mean, this is absolutely an absurdity. Look, let me calm down for a minute. We are still the strongest power in the country, in the world. We have the ability to do certain things. We've exaggerated the Chinese threat beyond all sorts of proportion. Where is China a huge threat? We are making it one. And the fact of the matter is, the American economy is huge. We have all sorts of abilities to do sorts of things, but we need a rational policy. And the problem was, in the Trump administration, we lacked that. And the Obama and the Biden administration, we seem to want to be confrontational. We are in the great advantage. We have all the advantages, and we ought not to cede them, and we ought not to over-exaggerate the extent of what we think the enemy is. We didn't understand the Soviet Union imploded. We became engaged in Vietnam for the wrong reasons. China has got a lot of problems, but China has huge weaknesses, and we need to understand that. We need not to be so confrontational.
Okay, and we are going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time, but thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.